The papers hit the kitchen table so hard the salt shaker jumped. "Sign tonight, Dad, or you lose everything." That was my daughter Vanessa, not a request, not even a demand dressed up as concern. Just a flat, cold sentence delivered the way you'd read a weather report, standing in the kitchen. My late wife Eleanor had picked the tile for, 22 years ago, back when we were still counting nickels to keep the trucks running. I looked at the stack of documents. Emergency Executive Transfer and Family Trust Amendment, the cover page said, in the kind of bland corporate font that tries very hard to look harmless. I looked at my daughter's face, which did not look harmless at all. And then I looked past her, out through the bay window at the driveway, where her husband Craig was still sitting in the car, engine running, like a man who wanted to be anywhere else but didn't have the spine to say so. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. My daughter had no idea, none at all, that 3 days earlier, sitting alone in my study at 2 in the morning, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, I had already reached into the one document she never thought to check, and quietly, legally, permanently, changed a single name. She thought she was standing over a beaten old man with a pen in his shaking hand. She had already lost. She just didn't know it yet, to understand how we ended up in that kitchen, with that ultimatum sitting between us like a loaded gun. You have to go back 8 days, to the morning we buried my wife. Eleanor Ashworth died on a Tuesday in March, in the back bedroom of the house we'd shared for 4 decades. With the morning light coming in soft through the curtains, she'd sewn herself back when we couldn't afford to buy any. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. 4 months of watching the strongest woman I ever knew get smaller and quieter, until one morning she just wasn't there anymore, and the house that had always felt full suddenly felt like a museum nobody visited. We built Ashworth Freight and Logistics together, Eleanor and I, starting in 1984 with one second-hand delivery truck and a bank account that had exactly $140 in it. She kept the books on a card table in our first apartment, while I drove overnight routes through 3 states, sleeping in truck stops, eating gas station sandwiches, coming home smelling like diesel and exhaustion. By the time we sold our first regional contract in 1991, we'd already survived 2 recessions, one lawsuit from a competitor trying to run us out of business, and more sleepless nights than I could ever count. Eleanor used to say the company wasn't built on capital, it was built on stubbornness. Ours, by the time she got sick, Ashworth Freight had grown into a $42 million regional logistics company with 11 distribution hubs across 4 states. Not the biggest player in the industry, but ours, every mile of it. Built by 2 people who used to eat cold sandwiches in a freezing parking lot and dream about a future neither of us could quite picture yet. I buried her on a Saturday. By the following Tuesday, 5 days later, my daughter was already standing in my kitchen with legal paperwork. I want to be fair to Vanessa because for most of her life, being fair to her came easily. She was a bright kid, sharp-tongued, competitive in a way that used to make Eleanor laugh and call her the little general. She went to business school on our dime, came back with an MBA and a fiancé named Craig Hale, a soft-spoken accountant who Eleanor liked well enough but never fully trusted. He agrees with her too fast. Eleanor told me once, years ago, watching them across a dinner table, a man who never disagrees with his wife isn't being loving. He's being absent. I didn't understand what she meant back then. I understood it completely 5 days after her funeral. "Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice level, "your mother is barely in the ground." "I know that," she said. And for one flickering second, something almost human passed across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the same brisk boardroom efficiency she used to close freight contracts, which is exactly why we need to move fast. "You're 71 years old, Dad. You just lost the person who ran half this company with you. You are in absolutely no condition to keep steering Ashworth through a transition like this alone." "I'm grieving," I said. "I'm not incapacitated." "You will be," she said, "if you try to carry all of this by yourself." She slid the folder another inch toward me, tapping the cover page with one manicured finger. "This puts Tyler's name on the controlling trust. He's 18 now, old enough to be listed as principal beneficiary. Craig and I will manage day-to-day operations until he's ready, exactly the way you and Mom always planned. Except we hadn't planned that. Not like this. Not 5 days after a funeral, with a folder that had clearly been drafted, reviewed, and printed long before Eleanor's casket was even lowered. Tyler was my grandson. 18 years old, reckless in the specific way that 18-year-old boys, with too much allowance and too little supervision, tend to be, more interested in his motorcycle and his phone than in anything resembling a balance sheet. I loved that boy the way you love your own blood, fiercely, uncritically, completely. I had spent 18 years watching him grow, spoiling him more than Eleanor ever fully approved of, already imagining the day I'd hand him the keys to everything we built. I did not yet know that the boy I loved, like blood, wasn't blood at all. I picked up the folder, weighed it in my hands like it might tell me something the words on the page wouldn't. I need time to read this properly, I said. I'm not signing anything I haven't reviewed with counsel. Something tightened behind Vanessa's eyes, just for a moment. Then it smoothed back over into patience practiced and thin. Of course, she said, take a few days. But Dad, the market's not going to wait for grief. Neither is the board. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharp against the tile Eleanor had picked out, and Craig pulled the car out of the driveway without so much as rolling down his window to say goodbye. I stood alone in my kitchen with a folder full of legal language in my hands, and the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I don't think I'd slept properly since Eleanor passed. Around 11, restless in a house that felt too big and too silent, I got in my car and drove to the office. I told myself I wanted the quiet of an empty building to think. The truth was, I wanted to stand somewhere that still felt like Eleanor. The executive floor still smelled faintly like her perfume in the hallway outside her old office, which nobody had touched since she stopped coming in. I badged into the lobby, nodded at the night guard, and took the private elevator up to the executive floor. I walked past my own office and headed straight for the records archive at the far end of the corridor, the room that held backup copies of every major trust document and financial filing tied to Ashworth Freight. If Vanessa was already circulating a trust amendment this polished, this fast, I wanted to see exactly what version of our family trust she was working from. I swiped my master key card at the archive door. The reader beeped, red light. I swiped again, same result. A voice came from the break room down the hall, too awake for 11 at night. Having trouble with that, Walter? Marcus Doyle stepped out of the shadows, still dressed for the office at an hour when no honest man has reason to be there. Marcus was our chief financial officer, 44 years old, the kind of man who wore his cologne like a personality trait. He'd been with the company 9 years, hired not long after Eleanor first got sick the first time. She'd had a health scare back then too, before the cancer, and we'd both agreed we needed someone sharp handling the numbers while our attention was divided. My card's not reading, I said. Ah, Marcus said, entirely too smooth. Security update. Craig authorized a full access protocol migration this weekend, given everything going on. Sensitive data, new safeguards. You know how it is. Craig authorized it, I repeated. He mentioned you'd be taking some time to grieve, Marcus said, still smiling. Figured it was a good window to handle the upgrade without disrupting daily operations. Nothing to worry about, Walter. Go home. Get some rest. I looked into his eyes for a long moment. There was nothing warm in them, just calculation, and beneath that, the faint, unmistakable flicker of a man enjoying himself. They were locking me out of my own archive, 5 days after my wife's funeral. And they were doing it politely, with a smile, using my own son-in-law's signature as cover. The old me, the man who used to drive 300 miles overnight on nothing but coffee and stubbornness, might have grabbed Marcus by his silk tie right there in that hallway. But I've spent 40 years learning that the man who loses his temper first loses the negotiation. So I only nodded. Security's important, I said. Tell Craig I appreciate the initiative. I turned and walked back to my office, feeling Marcus's eyes on my back the whole way. I sat down at my desk, closed the door, and opened the bottom drawer. Underneath the false panel was a biometric lock I'd installed a decade earlier. back when a rival firm tried to steal our client list through a corporate mole. Inside sat an old external hard drive, dust on its casing, holding an offline mirror of every financial record Ashworth Freight had ever generated. My own private backdoor into a system I no longer fully trusted, I connected it to my laptop. My fingers were an inch from the keyboard when my phone rang. Not my office line, my private cell. The number almost nobody had. The screen said Memorial Regional Hospital. Nobody calls from a hospital at midnight with good news. I answered, and a calm, urgent voice on the other end told me my grandson Tyler had been in a serious motorcycle accident. Trauma unit. Family needed to come immediately. I shut the laptop, shoved the hard drive back into its hidden compartment, and ran. The drive to the hospital is a blur I still can't fully reconstruct. I remember running red lights. I remember my hands shaking so hard on the wheel that I nearly missed the turn into the emergency entrance. I remember abandoning my car in a fire lane and sprinting through sliding glass doors into a wall of fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic. Vanessa was already there, pacing the hallway, phone in hand, typing something with an intensity that struck me even then as strange. Not the frantic scrolling of a mother checking for updates, but something colder, more deliberate. Craig sat slumped in a plastic chair, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. "What happened?" I demanded, gripping Craig's shoulder. He looked up at me, pale, sweating despite the hospital's air conditioning. "He took a curve too fast on that bike, hit the guardrail. He's got a bad leg laceration. Some internal bruising. He's stable, Dad, but he lost a lot of blood before the paramedics got there." Vanessa finally looked up from her phone, more irritated than afraid. "We had the trust signing scheduled for this afternoon," she muttered, almost to herself. "Now we're stuck here half the night." I stared at her. Her son was in a trauma bay and she was thinking about paperwork. Before I could say anything, the double doors swung open and a tired-looking doctor in blood-flecked scrubs stepped into the hallway. Family of Tyler Hale. We gathered around him in a tight, anxious knot. He held up a clipboard. "He's stable for now. We stopped the bleeding in his leg, but his hemoglobin's dropped low enough that we need to start a transfusion immediately to keep him out of shock." "Then do it," Vanessa said, already reaching for her purse. "Whatever it costs." The doctor's expression tightened. "It's not that simple. Tyler's blood type is AB positive. It's rare enough that our blood bank is critically short right now. There was a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate earlier tonight that drained most of our reserves. We need direct family donors to cross-match immediately." He looked between Craig and Vanessa. "We'll need to bring you both in for testing right away." The hallway seemed to go very quiet, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant beeping of monitors. All of it faded into the background while one thought detonated slowly, methodically in the back of my mind. AB positive, I am O positive, Eleanor was O positive. I remembered it clearly. We'd both donated blood together at company drives for 30 years running. Craig, I knew from an old medical form years back during a family scare, was a positive. Basic genetics doesn't bend for convenience. Two O-type parents can only produce an O-type child. An O parent and an A parent can produce a child who is type A, or occasionally type O, but never, under any circumstance, a child who is AB. The B allele had to come from somewhere. Somewhere that wasn't Craig. Somewhere that wasn't in this family at all. I turned my head slowly and looked at my son-in-law. I expected confusion. I expected a father asking the doctor to double-check the lab results, the way any confused parent would when told something impossible about their own child. Instead, Craig was staring at the floor, gripping the handrail on the wall so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He wasn't confused. He was terrified. And in that terrible frozen moment in a hospital hallway, 8 days after I buried my wife, I understood, with a certainty that felt like the floor dropping out from beneath me, that the boy bleeding out on an operating table down the hall, the boy I had loved without question for 18 years, the boy I was about to hand my entire life's work to, did not have a single drop of Ashworth blood in his veins. And Craig had known it the whole time. Vanessa was already arguing with the doctor, loudly demanding a private air ambulance be called to fly in blood from another facility, waving her credit card like it could rewrite biology. It was I would realize later a performance, a loud, aggressive distraction designed to make sure nobody looked too closely at the fact that she never once offered to be tested herself. I turned my gaze to Craig. He would not meet my eyes. He stared at the floor, sweat beading on his forehead, his whole body trembling under his rumpled suit jacket. He wasn't wondering if the lab had made a mistake. He was praying I hadn't done the math. I had the doctor, unmoved by Vanessa's theatrics, finally agreed to arrange emergency transport from a partner facility once she produced her card. With the immediate crisis diverted by money rather than honesty, an unbearable silence settled over the three of us in that sterile hallway. We were no longer a family waiting on a medical update. We were three people standing on the wreckage of a lie that had just cracked wide open, and only two of us knew it yet. I didn't confront Craig there, in the open. You don't corner a frightened animal in a public hallway. I learned that lesson decades ago, in boardrooms far less forgiving than this one. Instead, I suggested we get coffee from the vending machines downstairs while we waited. He hesitated, glancing toward Vanessa for permission like a man who'd forgotten how to make his own decisions. She waved him off without looking up from her phone. The hospital cafeteria at that hour was a dim, half-lit basement smelling of burnt coffee and industrial bleach. We sat across from each other at a sticky plastic table, 2 cups of bitter coffee going cold between us. That's quite a coincidence, I said quietly. AB positive. Eleanor and I were both you're A, if I remember right, from that old scare years back. I let the silence stretch. How exactly does that add up to Tyler Craig? He flinched like I'd struck him. The coffee cup shook in his hands. And then, instead of confusion, instead of a father demanding answers alongside me, he exploded with defensive anger. You're grieving, Dad. You're not thinking straight. It's a lab error. It happens all the time in ERs. I had spent 40 years across negotiating tables from men trying to hide the truth. I knew exactly what genuine confusion looked like, and I knew exactly what a cornered liar sounded like. Craig sounded like the second one. I studied him for a long moment. This man I'd watched marry my daughter 15 years ago, this soft, agreeable accountant Eleanor, never fully trusted. I thought about all the money we'd poured into giving Vanessa and Craig a comfortable life. The house, the private schooling for Tyler, the executive title at Ashworth, that Craig had never quite earned but always seemed to occupy anyway. You're probably right, I said finally, my voice dropping into something quieter, colder. Must just be a clerical error. What other explanation could there possibly be? He mumbled something incoherent and wouldn't look up again. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and left him alone in that fluorescent basement to drown in whatever guilt he still had left in him. The transfusion worked. By early morning, Tyler was stable, resting, expected to make a full recovery. I played my part well, relieved grandfather, exhausted but grateful, hugging Vanessa, shaking Craig's clammy hand, promising to check in later. Then I drove home, and instead of going to bed, I sat down at my kitchen table and started making a very different kind of plan. I needed proof before I said a word to anyone. That evening, I bought a container of soup, transferred it into my own dish to make it look homemade, and drove out to the sprawling house. Eleanor and I had helped Vanessa and Craig by 3 years earlier. I slipped a pair of latex gloves and 2 sterile bags into my coat pocket before I rang the doorbell. Craig answered, hollow-eyed, still in yesterday's clothes. Dad, you didn't have to come out. Couldn't sleep, I said, holding up the soup. Figured you two could use dinner you didn't have to cook. He let me in. Vanessa sat at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and a stack of hospital paperwork, more annoyed about the cost of the private transport than grateful her son was alive. While Craig heated the soup, I excused myself to wash up and slipped upstairs instead. Tyler's door was cracked open. He was asleep, leg propped on pillows, headphones over his ears. I didn't wake him. I slipped into his private bathroom, snapped on the gloves, and lifted his electric toothbrush from its holder by the bristle base, dropping it carefully into a sterile bag. On my way back down, I detoured through the mudroom off the garage, where Craig, creature of habit that he was, always tossed his gym clothes into a wicker hamper instead of carrying them the extra 10 feet to the laundry room. I found his gray athletic jacket on top of the pile. It took 30 seconds under the dim garage light to find what I needed. 2 dark hairs caught in the collar seam, roots intact. I sealed them into the second bag. 20 minutes later, I was making my excuses at the door, walking back to my car with proof of everything and nothing. All at once, the raw materials, not yet the answer. I didn't drive home. I drove 2 towns over to a private genetics lab I'd called ahead of time using an emergency line and paid $5,000 in cash for an expedited, anonymous analysis. The technician promised results within 48 hours. I stepped back out into the parking lot just as the first gray light of dawn broke over the horizon, and that's when my phone buzzed with an alert I hadn't seen in 10 years. A security notification from the private digital backdoor I'd built into Ashworth's servers back when we were fending off corporate spies. Someone was attempting to authorize a wire transfer of just under $4 million, using a forged version of my own digital signature. I drove straight home, locked myself in my study, and logged into the system I'd hidden from everyone, including my own family, for a decade. It took me less than an hour to trace the attempted transfer back to a terminal in the executive finance suite. Marcus Doyle, working the system at 5 in the morning with a spoofed authorization package, clumsy enough that I quarantined the whole transaction before he even noticed. Then I went deeper. What I found over the following 2 days made the missing $4 million feel almost secondary. Marcus had built an elaborate pipeline of shell companies, 4 of them registered in Delaware under forgettable names like Meridian Logistics Consulting and Harbor Point Freight Advisory, each one funneling fake invoices for phantom consulting work and non-existent software contracts through Ashworth's books. Each payment engineered to slide just beneath the threshold that would trigger an automatic board review. I cross-referenced the fraudulent invoice dates against our internal accounts, and the pattern that emerged made my stomach turn. The theft wasn't coming from operating revenue or expansion reserves. It was coming out of the employee pension fund, the retirement savings of every driver, warehouse manager, and dispatcher who'd spent decades building this company beside Eleanor and me. And the first large withdrawal had been initiated exactly 8 months earlier. The same week, Eleanor received her diagnosis. While I sat in oncology waiting rooms holding my wife's hand as she absorbed the worst news of her life, Marcus Doyle had been quietly draining our people's futures, betting correctly that grief would keep me distracted long enough not to notice. I sat back in my study chair, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, and let the pieces finally click into place. The pension fraud, the shell companies, the desperate wire transfer at dawn, and now, sitting in my study drawer, the trust amendment paperwork Vanessa had slammed onto my kitchen table 5 days after her mother's funeral. I pulled the folder out and flipped past the executive savory language, straight to the final clauses, the ones buried under dense boilerplate where nobody expects a grieving old man to look. There it was, a sweeping indemnification clause absolving the incoming trustees of any prior financial irregularities, paired with a mandatory authorization naming me as sole approving signatory for the upcoming year-end audit. The trust amendment was never about protecting me from stress. It was a legal shield. The year-end audit was 3 weeks out. An independent auditor would need less than an hour to find a $4 million hole in the pension fund. And if I signed that document, my signature would retroactively cover every fraudulent transaction that came before it. They weren't just stealing from me. They were building a case to make sure, when the walls came down, it was my name buried under the wreckage. They had badly underestimated the man they thought they'd already broken. I spent the next 2 days moving through my own life like a ghost, attending routine meetings, reviewing shipment reports, nodding politely at Marcus Doyle in the hallway with the same tired, grieving smile I'd been wearing since the funeral. I let Vanessa's calls about the trust documents go to voicemail, answering only when necessary, always with the same weary, non-committal excuse. I just need a little more time. Every hour of that performance was deliberate. A man standing in a burning house, calmly straightening his tie, quietly bolting every door from the inside. On the 3rd day, my burner phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The genetics lab. The results were ready. I drove out that same morning, collected the sealed envelope from the front desk, and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a dense report full of genetic markers and probability charts, but I skipped straight to the bolded line at the bottom: probability of paternity, 0.00%. The subject known as Tyler Hale is excluded as the biological offspring of the subject known as Craig Hale. I read it twice. There was no ambiguity in it, no room for a lab technician's error. Tyler, the boy I had loved, spoiled, and quietly groomed for 18 years to inherit everything Eleanor and I had built, carried not a single drop of Ashworth blood. For exactly 1 minute, grief hit me harder than anything since Eleanor's funeral. I mourned the grandson I thought I had. I found myself grateful, in a strange, aching way, that Eleanor hadn't lived to learn this particular truth. Then the grief burned away, replaced by something colder and infinitely more useful. If Craig wasn't Tyler's biological father, someone else was, and that someone had to be a person capable of covering their tracks with real sophistication. Someone who understood exactly how to move money through a company without triggering alarms. The missing $4 million. The shell companies. The desperate wire transfer at dawn. I thought of Marcus Doyle's cologne, his easy smile, his suspiciously convenient explanation for locking me out of the archive room. I picked up my phone and called Sam Delgado, a retired federal investigator I'd hired years earlier to vet a supplier we suspected of fraud. I didn't offer him pleasantries. I told him what I needed. Everything on Vanessa, everything on Marcus, every shadow either of them had ever cast, and I told him to start with Marcus Doyle. 3 days later, we sat in a booth at a diner on the edge of the industrial district, a thick manila folder between us on the sticky table. "You were right to start with Doyle," Sam said, sliding the folder toward me. "They weren't nearly as careful as they thought." The first photograph was dated 3 weeks earlier. Vanessa and Marcus at a secluded table in an out-of-town restaurant, his hand resting over hers in a way that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. Behind it, university transcripts showing they'd met at business school 20 years ago, long before Vanessa ever introduced the family to Craig. Hotel receipts, flight manifests, a relationship that had never actually ended, only gone underground, running quietly alongside her marriage the entire time. "I pulled a discrete sample from Doyle 2 days ago," Sam said. "Ran it against the genetic profile you already had. He's Tyler's biological father. Your daughter was already pregnant with his child before she ever married Craig Hale." The full shape of it settled over me like ice water. Vanessa hadn't married Craig for love. She'd married him for cover, a stable, agreeable husband willing to raise another man's son as his own, while she kept her real partnership with Marcus running quietly in parallel, both of them positioned exactly where they needed to be to eventually take control of everything Eleanor and I had built. Sam slid one more document across the table. A printed email, 10 years old, recovered from a deleted server archive. Sent from Craig's private account to Vanessa's. "I got the test results back. It's confirmed. I'm sterile. Permanent. From the infection years ago. If your father ever finds out I can't give you a biological heir, he'll invoke the bloodline clause in the trust and cut us out completely. We can't let that happen. Tyler has to stay the plan. Your dad can never know." Craig had known for 10 years. He'd known Tyler wasn't his son, known Vanessa's affair with Marcus had never stopped, and instead of coming to me with the truth, he'd chosen silence. Chosen it year after year, because the alternative meant losing the comfortable, subsidized life he'd built on top of a lie. Eleanor had insisted, decades ago, on a strict bloodline clause in our family trust, that controlling ownership of Ashworth Freight could only pass to a direct biological descendant. She wanted to protect the company we'd bled to build from ever falling into the hands of an opportunist. Craig knew about that clause. He knew his sterility disqualified him from ever satisfying it. So he'd made his bargain: raise another man's child as his own, keep smiling at Sunday dinners, and let his wife quietly steal a fortune out from under her own dying mother. I sat in that booth for a long time after Sam finished talking, the diner's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and felt something in me go very still and very cold. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a man who had just discovered that everyone closest to him had spent a decade preparing to bury him alive. "What's your next move, Walter?" Sam asked quietly. I closed the folder and stood, tucking it under my arm. "I'm going home," I said. "I'm going to call my daughter and my son-in-law over tonight. I'm going to tell them I've decided to sign the trust amendment. And then, Sam, I'm going to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves with." I drove home and spent the next hour staging the house the way a director stages a scene. I dimmed the lights in my study, set a framed photo of Eleanor on the corner of the desk, where her smile would be the first thing anyone saw, and let my collar sit crooked, my hair unkempt. I called Vanessa, let my voice crack with real, if strategically deployed, exhaustion. "I think you're right," I told her. "I can't keep doing this alone. Come by tonight. Bring the papers. I'm ready to sign." I heard the triumph in the silence before she answered. They arrived within the hour, Vanessa in a sharp black blazer, Craig trailing behind her like a man walking to his own sentencings, without knowing it yet. We sat in my study, Vanessa and Craig in the chairs across from my desk, the framed photo of Eleanor watching over all three of us. "You were right, Vanessa," I said, letting my voice tremble. "Without your mother, this house feels like a tomb. I'm tired. I want to rest. I want this weight off my shoulders." Something flickered across Vanessa's face. Not sympathy, but satisfaction, quickly smoothed into an expression of practiced concern. "We understand completely, Dad. You've carried this company for so long, it's time to let us take it from here." Craig reached over and patted my hand with a tenderness that made my stomach turn, considering what I now knew he'd been hiding for a decade. "We'll protect everything you and Mom built," he said. "I promise." I nodded slowly, playing my part to the very end. "Draw up the final signing for the board meeting Friday morning," I said. "I want it done in front of everyone. I want this over with quickly." Vanessa's eyes lit with barely contained triumph. "We'll have it ready," she said. "A clean, seamless transition." "It's the right decision, Dad." I watched them stand and let themselves out, listened to their car pull away down the driveway, and the moment their taillights disappeared, the trembling old man I'd been performing for the last hour vanished completely. I stood, straightened my spine, and walked to the small home, safe hidden beneath my desk. Because 3 days before any of this, 3 days before Vanessa ever slammed that folder on my kitchen table, I had already done the one thing she never thought to check. I want to explain now what I did. 3 nights before Vanessa ever set foot in my kitchen with that folder, it started the morning I first noticed something was wrong. Not with Tyler's blood type, not yet, but earlier than that, the week Eleanor was still in hospice, drifting in and out of consciousness, when Vanessa had started dropping by more often than usual, always asking casual questions about how the trust was structured, and what happens to the company if something happens to both of you. At the time, I read it as a daughter grasping for reassurance during her mother's final days. Looking back, I understand now she was gathering intelligence. The family trust Eleanor and I built together, back in the early 90s, when the company started generating real money, named a single controlling entity as the ultimate beneficiary of Ashworth Freight's voting shares, a mechanism designed so that no single relative could unilaterally seize control without the consent of the others. For most of its life, that controlling entity had one name attached to it as principal beneficiary, our grandson. 3 nights before Vanessa's ultimatum, sitting alone in my study, at 2 in the morning with Eleanor's photograph watching me from the desk, I opened the trust documents myself and used my standing authority as sole surviving trustee to make one quiet legal amendment. I didn't touch the company's operational structure. I didn't freeze any accounts. I didn't tip my hand in any way that a casual read of the paperwork would reveal. I simply changed one name. I removed Tyler as principal beneficiary of the controlling trust. Not out of malice toward him, not yet, since at that point I still believed him to be my grandson by blood, and redirected it, provisionally, into a newly created charitable vehicle I named the Eleanor Ashworth Memorial Trust. It was, on paper, a modest, unremarkable estate planning adjustment, the kind any attorney might recommend to a grieving widower reconsidering his affairs. I filed it quietly through Victor's office, had it notarized, and told no one. Not Vanessa. Not Craig. Not even Victor knew the full reason behind it, only that I'd asked him to make the change and keep it strictly confidential. I did it because some instinct, some old boardroom sense honed over 40 years of watching people's faces when money is on the table, told me that the speed and polish of Vanessa's paperwork after Eleanor's funeral didn't smell like grief management. It smelled like a plan that had been sitting ready for a long time, just waiting for an opening. I had no idea, that night, how right that instinct would turn out to be. So when Vanessa slid the emergency executive transfer and family trust amendment across my kitchen table and told me to sign it tonight or lose everything, she was operating from an assumption that no longer matched reality. The document she wanted me to sign still referenced the old trust structure, the one where Tyler's name sat as principal beneficiary, the one that would have handed her, and Craig effective operational control the moment my signature landed on the page. She had no idea I'd already moved the ground beneath her feet. Even if I'd signed everything she put in front of me that night, it wouldn't have mattered. The controlling shares she was maneuvering to seize had already been redirected 3 days earlier, quietly, permanently, into a trust she'd never heard of, filed by an attorney she didn't know I'd already brought in. Her entire ultimatum, delivered with such icy confidence, was aimed at a target that no longer existed. I sat with that knowledge for 3 days, letting her believe she still held all the leverage, letting her and Craig make their preparations for Friday's board meeting, letting Marcus Doyle continue believing his wire fraud was still safely buried. I needed the full picture before I moved, and by Thursday night, thanks to Sam Delgado's investigation and the DNA results sitting in my desk drawer, I finally had it. Friday morning came in clear and cold. I dressed in the charcoal suit I hadn't worn since closing our largest regional contract a decade earlier, the armor I saved for moments that required absolute precision. I fastened Eleanor's old cufflinks, the ones she'd given me for our 20th anniversary, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. The broken, trembling widower I'd been performing all week was gone. What looked back at me was the man who'd built Ashworth Freight out of a single rusted truck and $140. I drove to the office. Victor Lang met me in the parking garage, his black leather briefcase in hand. 2 federal agents waiting discreetly by his car, Agent Whitfield from the FBI's white-collar division, and her partner, both of whom had spent the last 36 hours combing through the financial evidence I'd handed over regarding Marcus Doyle's shell companies and the stolen pension funds. "Everything's in order," Victor said quietly. "The amended trust filing is airtight. Whatever they try to push through this morning, it won't touch a single share." "Good," I said. "Let's go remind my daughter what she actually married into." We walked into the boardroom together. It was packed. Vanessa had clearly wanted an audience for her moment of triumph. She sat at the head of the long table, in the chair that had been mine for 30 years, Craig beside her looking pale and damp with sweat, Marcus Doyle on her other side wearing his usual smug, overcalant confidence. A cluster of new executives I didn't recognize filled the remaining seats, hires Marcus had clearly brought in over the past week. People with no loyalty to anyone but the paycheck currently signing their name. Tyler sat near the far end, scrolling on his phone, oblivious to the storm about to break over his head. I walked the length of the table and took the only open seat, at the opposite end from Vanessa. She smiled at me, the practiced, patient smile of a woman who believed she'd already won. "This is the final version of the trust amendment," she said, sliding a folder toward me, a heavy gold pen resting on top. "The board's already reviewed and approved the transition. All we need is your signature." I looked down at the folder. I looked back up at her. "No," I said. The smile didn't leave her face immediately. It took a second, like a light flickering before it dies. "Excuse me?" Before she could say anything more, the boardroom doors opened. Victor walked in first, flanked by Agent Whitfield and her partner. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Victor didn't waste a word on pleasantries. He set a sealed envelope in the center of the table, the DNA report, and let it slide until it stopped between Vanessa and Craig. "I represent Walter Ashworth in all matters concerning the Ashworth Family Trust," he announced, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. This document is an independently verified genetic analysis, certified 48 hours ago. It confirms with 0% probability of error that the individual known as Tyler Hale is not the biological son of Craig Hale. A gasp rippled through the table. Tyler looked up from his phone, his face draining of color as he glanced between his parents, searching for someone to tell him it wasn't true. Vanessa's composed mask cracked instantly into something raw and panicked. Craig sat frozen, staring at the envelope like it might detonate. Furthermore, Victor continued, his voice flat and merciless, under the terms established by the late Eleanor Ashworth, control of this company is legally and permanently bound to verified biological heirs of the Ashworth bloodline. Because Tyler Hale does not meet that criterion, and because this transfer was pursued through deliberate biological fraud, the trust amendment currently on this table is void. It has no legal force whatsoever. I watched Vanessa's hands begin to shake against the polished wood. "There's more," I said quietly, and every head in the room turned to me. "3 days before you handed me that ultimatum in my kitchen, Vanessa, I had already amended the underlying trust. Tyler's name, the name your entire plan was built around, was already removed as principal beneficiary before you ever printed that folder. You built an ultimatum around a document that no longer existed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard in a boardroom. Derek? No, not Derek. I catch myself even now, so many years later, still slipping back to Eleanor's name for the son we never had." Craig shot to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at his wife, some pale imitation of righteous outrage flooding his face. "You made me raise another man's child. You used me." "Sit down," Vanessa snapped, but there was no command left in her voice, only panic. She turned to Marcus. "You told me the transfer would go through clean. You told me he'd never look this closely." Marcus's composure cracked wide open. "Don't put this all on me. You're the one who wanted to move faster, drain the pension while he was distracted with his wife dying." The room erupted. 19 years of buried lies came apart in real time, in front of a room full of stunned executives who had no idea, until that exact moment, what kind of people they'd agreed to work for. I let it happen. I watched them tear each other apart with something close to clinical detachment, remembering every freezing night Eleanor and I spent sleeping in the cab of our first delivery truck, every dollar we clawed together by sheer stubbornness, while these two people who never bled for any of it had spent the past decade calculating exactly how much of it they could steal. Aja Whitfield finally stepped forward. "Marcus Doyle, Vanessa Hale, you're both under arrest for federal wire fraud and embezzlement from an employee pension fund." The cuffs closing around their wrists made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Vanessa screamed something about the 20 years she'd given this family, about deserving half of everything. Marcus went quiet, defeated, the fight gone out of him the moment the federal charge landed. I turned to Craig, who was still standing, tears streaming down his face, waiting, I think, for some flicker of fatherly mercy. There wasn't any left in me. "You had 10 years to tell me the truth," I said. "You chose silence because silence was comfortable. You're terminated, effective immediately. The house is in the company's name. You have 24 hours to clear out." He collapsed back into his chair, sobbing, and I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a debt finally settled. I looked, last, at Tyler, 18 years old, staring at the wreckage of everything he'd believed about himself. "You didn't ask for any of this," I told him, my voice softer now. "You're not responsible for what your parents did. But you're not an Ashworth heir, and I won't pretend otherwise. I'll cover your college tuition and living expenses for 1 year. That gives you time to build something real on your own. After that, you're on your own, but you'll be starting from an honest place, which is more than anyone gave your mother." He nodded, wiped his eyes, and walked out of the boardroom without another word. 6 months passed. The federal case against Vanessa and Marcus moved with the slow, grinding certainty of real justice, 15 years each, for wire fraud and pension embezzlement. The full $4 million traced through their shell companies and eventually returned, dollar for dollar, to the employee retirement accounts they'd tried to drain dry. I stood in front of the company at an all-hands meeting the week the funds were restored and watched 2 decades of anxiety finally lift off the faces of drivers and warehouse staff who'd trusted us with their futures. Craig, stripped of his title and his subsidized life, ended up working retail on the far side of town, learning at 51 years old the value of an hourly wage he'd never once had to think about before. I felt no satisfaction in it, and no pity either, just the quiet certainty that people eventually harvest exactly what they plant. I rehired every loyal executive Marcus had pushed out during his brief reign, restoring Ashworth Freight to something like the company Eleanor and I had built it to be. And on a cold, clear morning 6 months after that boardroom, I stood on the rooftop of our headquarters with Victor beside me, and I finished what I'd started that night in my study, 3 days before Vanessa ever issued her ultimatum. I signed the final documents making the change permanent. Half of my personal holdings in Ashworth Freight went into the Eleanor Ashworth Memorial Trust, now fully realized as a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing careers in logistics, business, and the trades, the kind of opportunity Eleanor and I never had back when we were counting nickels in a freezing truck cab. The other half was distributed into an employee ownership program, so the people who'd actually built this company with their hands would finally own a piece of what they'd built. Nobody would ever again walk into my kitchen 5 days after a funeral and slide an ultimatum across the table, because there was no longer a single name left to change, alter, or steal. Everything that mattered had already been placed somewhere no ultimatum could reach. Family isn't a matter of blood, and it certainly isn't a matter of a marriage certificate or a name on a beneficiary form. It's loyalty, proven over years, not claimed in a single desperate night. I lost a daughter, a son-in-law, and a grandson I loved without ever knowing the truth. But I kept the one thing that actually mattered. The company Eleanor and I bled to build, now finally safe, finally honest, finally in the hands of the people who actually deserved it. She thought she'd cornered a broken old man with a pen in his shaking hand. She had no idea I'd already changed one name.